It is a blessing to be here. I am cognizant of your time. There's no benediction at the end, no altar call, so we're just going to take as little time as we can to get all the information that we can out. I just want to give just some greetings to the meeting. Today you'll hear from, well, they'll introduce themselves, but many of you know Dennis Madsen from Long Range Planning and Colonel Hamilton, who's the city administrator. One, let me say thank you for everybody that came out. You become the central hubs of information for this community. Though this is a little bit more formal than I usually have them, I also want to let you know the premise overall of today really is a lot of work in about, I want to say a better part of maybe 10 months since I've been in office, if I'm doing my math correctly. But this obviously goes back for a long, long amount of time. This property that we sit in is where my mother graduated from, aunts, cousins, the list goes on. And today is not necessarily just to talk about the Johnson name or heritage, but more so what is the ownership that the city has on the 44 acres. We will give a very condensed version of all the work, and I, again, cannot say thank you enough to Colonel Hamilton, the administration, and my colleagues that has been put into analyzing what you will see today. I have knocked on hundreds of doors, discussed this property and other properties in Northwest Huntsville at length. And the number one thing that comes up is property value and economic development. We understand there are variables with that, decrease in crime, increase in infrastructure, the list goes on. But today is something that I feel, again, after hours of research, bugging, and sort of getting perspectives from everybody in Northwest Huntsville, is a direction of which I think is unique, and if done correctly, will make a substantial step for Northwest Huntsville.
One of the things that I think is notable in particular about this site, the more that we looked at it as planners, was really apparent to community leadership pretty much from the get-go. This is a very unique opportunity for the community to achieve some of the goals that Councilman Keith mentioned and that Councilman Showers referenced when he was in office, that there is the opportunity here not only to see redevelopment on this site, but to do economic development for the community, to show that there is a market here, to show that there is a great atmosphere for investment. One of the challenges, and one of the reasons a lot of you are kind of counting back going January 16, we're a little ways away from that. One of the reasons we took a lot of time to do this is because we recognized the distinct challenges of the Johnson High School site. In no small part, if you think about all the other high schools in the Huntsville system, and you think about where they're located, and you think about what they're close to, there really isn't anything like Johnson in them. You've got Lee, which is right on Meridian, Huntsville High, which is right next to Whole Foods Development and right on Bob Wallace. You have Grissom, both old and new, which are both on big commercial corridors. One exception may be Columbia, but that's really smack in the middle or on the edge of a giant office park. Johnson is really unique in the way it's situated, not particularly close to a major commercial corridor, and also kind of tucked within a lot of single-family residential. So we really, really wanted to be deliberate and careful about how we thought of planning for this site. And going back, we started first with a public, kind of an open house last January, and then followed it up with a public workshop. Some of you may remember seeing we decided to take that opportunity during the open house just to throw up some images, a range of them, residential, commercial, and open space, and say, give us your feedback. What kind of resonates here? What doesn't? What catches your fancy as potential for reuse on the site, and what doesn't? We shared a wide array of images, both from commercial. Some of them folks liked, mostly neighborhood scale type stuff. Let's see. Some folks didn't like, mostly the general retail, but you kind of got answers all over the board, really with the only consistency being kind of small and neighborhood scale. On the park side, we offered a lot of different potential uses. Most of what I think was popular was really the passive uses, recreation fields, community gardens, plazas, public art, nothing really intense, nothing that would attract a really large crowd. In contrast, what was not particularly well liked was sort of undefined space, as well as dog parks, splash pads, and the more high-intensity public spaces uses. Really didn't resonate. In terms of residential, we just showed a really broad range of what residential could be. And this is where it got kind of interesting. Focus more on kind of live-work units, a place where you have a business and live over it, as well as some senior living. What was not particularly well-liked, and I don't think it's really a surprise given the context, was apartments. Anything heavy multifamily really wasn't going to catch here. We're actually kind of glad to hear that, because if you're looking at it from a planner's perspective, you're thinking that's not really consistent with the fabric of the neighborhood around it. That's not really a use that is going to add value to the neighborhoods around it. So even though we didn't get a lot of programmatic consistency, we didn't have everyone say we want this type of building or we want that type of use, we did hear really over and over two consensus goals. There were two things that really rose to the top that we heard. And Councilman Keith referenced them already. One was respecting the neighborhoods that are adjacent to the campus. Again, this is a very different campus. You have these older, very well-established, very stable neighborhoods that are right next door. We want to be cognizant of that. We want to be careful and not do anything that really upsets the balance or the quality of life in those neighborhoods. But at the same time, we want to create a level of economic development and value add to the community as well. And this is a fantastic opportunity to potentially do that, to show that there's market here, to show that there's value here, and to get private sector investment occurring in an area where, frankly, it hasn't occurred for quite some time. So to do that, we want to look a little bit at the context. Again, you see a lot of single-family neighborhoods around it. Johnson's kind of in red there. You see a lot of single-family neighborhoods around it. So we wanted to look at what were some of the things that were going to affect, when we go back to the drawing board as planners, how this site might shake out. And there are a few challenges. I'm going to read off a number of them when we really looked at the demographics. One, in this area, in the census tract, housing and population growth have been rather stagnant. You haven't seen a whole lot of growth. You haven't seen a whole lot of new housing developed in the past decade. Median incomes in the census tract are a little bit lower than city average. And there has not been significant market rate new housing construction in this census tract or adjacent census tracts for almost 30 years. You've really seen, if you're tracking new housing starts, the growth occur predominantly in the far west and in the far east. In our historic cores, there hasn't been that much growth. That doesn't mean that the prognosis is all sort of doom and gloom. In fact, there are a lot of really good aspects to the market in this area. One is that vacancy rates are low. When you talk about vacancy rates, when you have low vacancy rates, that suggests that there's actually a market there that's not being met, that there is potential to build housing and have a market for it. Home ownership rates within the census tract are actually higher than the city average, which means though the vacancy's low, it doesn't mean that they're all being backfilled by renters. You actually have a fair amount, a very high amount of home ownership. There's a lot of families in the area, which means folks like living here, folks want to raise families here. That's a great sign for redevelopment. And the interesting thing is that MLS prices in these census tracts and in and around Johnson have actually rebounded to pre-recession levels. That's a great sign that there's still interest in housing in the area, even after Johnson itself was closed. It's also important to understand some of the physical constraints when you're talking about market. Not just the acreage, but how you can use the acreage. This little map, you can see kind of the light purple and the dark, that's floodplain map. In floodplain, you can build, if you build up the elevation. In floodway, which is the darker color, you can't build at all. So there's a little bit of a physical constraint on the site in terms of what you could or could not develop. So all that starts to inform how we would approach, going back to the drawing board, how do we approach what could actually happen on the site, how it might develop in the future. What we start with typically as planners is a framework plan. We like to kind of dissect what's going on the site, figure out what types of program could go in specific areas, and then drill down in a little more detail from there. And I know this, you can't read this right now, I'm just going to show this and then zoom in on a few select pieces. The framework plan, you can see just very general blocks of uses that could potentially occur on the site. And someone asked me as I was walking in, and it's a great question, so, they remembered that the big picture public process that happened a year and a half ago. He said, did this all just kind of go out the window? It's actually the exact opposite. All of this, even though it has been a lot of time and a lot of homework done since then, all of this really stems from the public hearings and the public workshops that we had. So zooming in on some of this, we want to there's potentially an opportunity to create a new green space, a small public park, potentially with a pond in the center of the development. That takes advantage of the fact that there's floodplain there, an area where you can't really build anyway, and it allows you to do some shared retention. I'm sure everyone has been following Houston in the news, and you see a big city struggle with managing stormwater. Being able to do some kind of coordinated on-site retention and get a park out of it is a great strategy for making sure that the area is developed and can deal with stormwater issues. So that's potential to create kind of an open space that can be used and can serve kind of an infrastructure function. Another piece of that is creating a kind of a greenway buffer, sort of a walkway around the perimeter, a walking trail. We heard a lot of folks kind of fond of that idea, and it gives you kind of two positives there. One is that it provides this recreational amenity, a nice, safe, comfortable place to walk around the neighborhood, but it also gives you a little bit of a buffer between the existing neighborhood and new development. Nothing too huge to make it feel cut off, but it gives you a little bit of kind of wiggle room between new and existing. The other piece that's an opportunity is the surface streets, making sure that they link into the new development. What you really want to make sure is that this doesn't feel like some sort of cul-de-sac or isolated community, that feels part of the community, that those things are linked together, that the folks who live here now can take advantage of the new amenities that would come with new development. In the other corner, zooming in, one of the areas where you could potentially see new housing growth is kind of that large elevated northern parcel where you could see some new single-family housing. Really important to acknowledge again that there is market here and that there is an opportunity here to demonstrate that there's value and market in this part of the city, that you can show that you can build and sell new housing in this market. And I think there's a great opportunity to develop new single-family housing, very much in keeping with the surrounding community on this piece of property. Another opportunity is really looking at the gymnasium. If we can retain that at a minimum, gyms are always in short supply throughout the city, and closed recreation spaces are always in short supply. It's a great opportunity to save that, but it's also an opportunity to create almost a little kind of town center. If you think about Providence, if you're familiar with that, nothing on that scale, but if you start to create kind of just a little neighborhood area, a place where you have a little foot traffic and you happen to run into your neighbor on a Saturday morning while you're out walking or running errands, or you walk up to have a pickup basketball game, it starts to be able to form what we think could be, in that purple area nearby, something like a neighborhood center. Now, when it comes to what kind of development could go in there, it could be a wide array of things. We've talked about medical office in the past. I think there's definitely demand in this area for some level of medical office. We've talked about business incubators. We've talked about small business startups, things from coffee shops to a pizza place to a sandwich shop. That's an area where you could see it playing off the gymnasium and creating this kind of small community node, a place where that gives it a little bit of its identity, and that may be buffered with another type of housing, maybe some townhomes or something that adds a little housing variety and buffers the commercial from the existing single family. And lastly, looking at getting housing variety in the area, adding potentially some patio homes. When we talk about those, they tend to be what we call senior-friendly homes, where you don't have a lot of steps in them. They may be a little smaller and a little more manageable. The yard's a little smaller and a little more manageable. They're walkable to the park or walkable to the town center, so they're a little bit more comfortable. And I think many of us know or have a relative, someone who maybe has a little more house than they need right now. The kids have moved away. They really can't afford, now they're on a fixed income, to take care of all that house. They'd like to get into something a little smaller, but they don't want to leave their neighborhood. They don't want to move any farther away from their church or from their friends. This is an opportunity to add a little bit of that senior-friendly housing and allow folks to do what we call aging in place. So that's really what we call a framework plan, and that starts to inform how those uses might be able to shake out in the future. Now, I have to say again, this is a framework. When we start to engage the community as to how this gets built out, it could change in terms of exactly what the pieces look like, but this is something that we think could achieve the idea of incentivizing economic development, economic activity in the area, showing that there is a market, that there is value here, and at the same time being respectful to the adjacent neighborhoods, not overbuilding to the point where we feel like the development is overwhelming the adjacent neighborhoods. The second follow-up, and this one you can take a closer look at when we go out into the lobby afterwards, really just shows some potential ideas. I know that sometimes we talk about patio homes or townhome development or single family, and that's an abstract concept. This just starts to assign some images to what those program pieces might be. It's kind of a very straightforward example of what might actually happen on development, but again, once we start engaging the private sector community in terms of what could develop here, I can almost guarantee it's not going to look exactly like any of those buildings, but it could very much be the same type, the same level of quality that we'd like to see. It's also important to note this is a really big site. Again, this is bigger than most high school sites, pushing on about 50 acres, less than 40 when you take the floodway out. You're probably going to see partners in development. I don't think there's really one person who could come in and do all of this, especially with the mix of uses that you could see on here. But we really wanted to sort of show y'all what we're thinking in terms of the types that might go on here, and really start what the next step would be. And again, this is, we're still very much in the planning phase. This is as detailed as it gets. What we really think is, from here we go to a development RFP. Again, that really leads into the idea of finding market partners, finding private sector partners, because in the end, that's going to make this sustainable. That's going to prove that economic development can succeed here.